Please. I haven't eaten since yesterday. Could I have a little water and some leftover food? You can't stand here. This is private property.
The rain battered against the heavy iron security gates of the sprawling estate, turning the immaculate gravel pathways into slick ribbons of mud and dark stone. I stood shivering just outside the high perimeter
take
wall,
this. It's warm.
my shoulders hunched beneath a
Thank
heavy,
you so
tattered
much.
wool coat, my boots caked in wet earth, and a coarse, artificial gray beard digging into my jawline. In less than 48 hours, I was scheduled to marry Clara Vance, a woman my family had insisted was the ideal match for my social standing and corporate future. Yet before I legally bound my fortune, my family name, and the rest of my existence to hers, I needed to discover one terrifying truth. How would she treat a man who appeared to possess absolutely nothing in the world? Inside the gates, near the brilliantly illuminated rear terrace where estate staff scurried through final preparations, Clara's voice rang out sharply over the rising wind. Why is he even standing out there? Have security chase him away before our invited guests start arriving. People like that always carry some pathetic story, and if you feed one of them, a dozen more will crawl out of the woodwork tomorrow. I lowered my head, feigning embarrassment, but a cold knot tightened instantly in my chest. This was the woman I was on the verge of marrying. Without another word, I turned and began walking away into the worsening downpour, my spirits as gray and sodden as the evening sky. Before I had taken 10 paces down the lane, a young estate assistant hurried down the garden path, holding a wide umbrella in one hand and a small wooden tray in the other. "Sir, please wait," she called out, her voice gentle and steady against the storm. Chloe Hayes had no inkling that the bedraggled vagrant shivering in the rain was actually Marcus Sterling, founder and CEO of Vance Global, nor could she guess that her simple act of compassion was about to alter both of our lives irrevocably. The rain grew heavier as I retreated toward a sheltered stone alcove near the side service entrance, playing my part as a freezing traveler. Most of the estate employees had hurried past him without a second glance, entirely absorbed in the frantic logistics of the upcoming multi-million-dollar wedding celebration. But Chloe had doubled back, carrying a steaming bowl of vegetable soup, 2 thick slices of toasted bread, and a mug of hot herbal tea. "You shouldn't stay exposed to this weather," she said softly, extending the tray toward me with genuine care. "You'll catch something fierce." I looked up, genuinely surprised by the warmth in her tone. "I don't mean to be a nuisance," I replied, pitching my voice lower. "You're not a nuisance," Chloe assured me with a reassuring smile. "Everyone deserves a hot meal when the world turns cold on them." The cold drizzle continued to tap against the glass pane of the service door, while I adjusted the collar of my oversized coat, making sure the artificial gray fibers of the beard remained securely glued along my jaw. In the distance, the muffled strains of a string quartet drifted from the main ballroom, mingling with the laughter of affluent guests who had flown in from across the country to witness the union between Marcus Sterling and Clara Vance. I stayed in the shadows of the stone porch, letting the damp chill seep through my layers just enough to keep the charade believable. A few minutes later, the door creaked open again, and Chloe stepped out onto the landing. This time, she carried a small paperback book and a fresh thermos of hot water, her eyes scanning the dim corners of the courtyard until she spotted me huddled near the pillar. "I figured you might need something to pass the hours," she said, holding out the thermos and a small paper cup. "It's going to be a long night, and the rain isn't letting up anytime soon." I accepted the items, my fingers brushing against hers, noting how steady and unhesitating her touch was. "Thank you," I murmured, keeping my voice raspy and subdued. "Most people around here wouldn't even look twice at someone dressed like this, let alone bring them hot tea." Chloe leaned against the low stone railing, gazing out toward the darkened gardens where the manicured hedges dissolved into the mist. "Most people here are too busy worrying about their own status," she said softly, a hint of fatigue slipping into her tone. "They don't see anyone unless that person can advance their career or stroke their ego. I watched her profile in the dim light of the wall sconce, struck by her sharp observation. And what about you? What are you doing in a place like this, if you see right through it? She offered a faint, self-deprecating smile. Paying off tuition and supporting my younger brother while he finishes his medical degree. The agency placed me here for the catering setup and auxiliary staff coordination this week. The pay is high enough to cover half a semester, so I keep my head down and do the work. Before I could reply, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the quiet hum of the evening. Chloe! What on earth are you doing fraternizing with the help? Or worse, whatever that is out in the yard? Clara stepped onto the terrace, her designer silk wrap clutched tightly around her shoulders, her expression twisting into an immediate scowl as she surveyed the scene. She didn't look at me with anger. She looked at me with absolute chilling indifference, as if I were a piece of discarded trash left on a pristine carpet. He was just cold, Miss Vance, Chloe answered immediately, her voice polite but firm as she straightened up from the railing. I brought him some water. Clara crossed her arms, her diamond bracelet flashing under the porch lights. We have professional security for a reason, Chloe. If vagrants realize they can wander onto the grounds and receive room service, we'll never hear the end of it from our investors. Finish whatever you're doing and get back inside immediately. The rehearsal dinner starts in 20 minutes, and my father expects every staff member to be at their station. Chloe lowered her eyes, masking a flicker of resentment. Yes, Ms. Vance. Right away. Clara turned on her heel and swept back inside, the heavy oak door latching shut with a dull, final click that echoed across the stone courtyard. Silence settled back over the alcove, broken only by the steady drumbeat of the rain. I sat quietly on the bench, holding the warm paper cup between my palms, while the bitter reality of what I had just witnessed settled deep into my bones. I'm sorry, Chloe whispered after a moment, glancing back toward the door as if checking to ensure Clara was entirely out of earshot. She's under a lot of pressure with the wedding arrangements, but nobody deserves to be spoken to like an object. I looked up at her, my mind racing as the pieces of my test fell into place with devastating clarity. She made her priorities very clear, I said quietly. Don't let one cold person make you lose faith in everyone, Chloe said with a reassuring nod, turning to head back inside. Stay dry. I'll try to check on you before morning. As the door closed behind her, I sat alone in the dark, staring at the empty cup. My family had spent months praising Clara's sophistication, her pedigree, and her sharp business acumen. They had assured me she was the perfect partner to stand beside me at the head of Vance Global. But watching her dismiss a fellow human being with such casual cruelty had answered the most important question of my life. The illusion was shattered, and as I listened to the faint sounds of celebration echoing from within the mansion, I knew that everything was about to change. The morning light broke gray and flat over the manicured lawns of the estate, washing away the shadows of the storm, but leaving behind a heavy, humid chill. I stood near the edge of the old stone greenhouse, pretending to inspect a rusted hand trowel I had picked up from a potting bench, while my eyes remained fixed on the rear terrace of the mansion. Across the gravel driveway, the frantic movement of caterers and florists had already resumed. Huge floral arrangements of white imported roses and cascading orchids were being unloaded from refrigerated vans, while supervisors with clipboards barked instructions at men in dark suits. It didn't take long for Clara to step out onto the terrace, flanked by two of her closest bridesmaids. She was holding a silver tablet, reviewing seating charts and muttering under her breath about logistics. Even from a distance, the rigid tension in her posture was obvious. As she walked down the low stone steps toward the grand courtyard, an elderly estate gardener, struggling to wheel a heavy wooden container filled with decorative boxwoods, accidentally clipped the toe of Clara's designer heel with the edge of the planter. Clara stumbled half a step, her face instantly flushing with annoyance as she yanked her foot away. "Watch what you're doing!" she snapped, her voice carrying sharply across the quiet garden path. These shoes were custom made for the rehearsal dinner. One scuff costs more than your entire weekly wage. The elderly man bowed his head repeatedly, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he gripped the handles of the cart. "I am terribly sorry, Miss Vance. I misjudged the turning space." "Just move the plants out of the main walkway," Clara said dismissively, turning her back on him without waiting for another word. She linked arms with one of her friends and glided toward the marquee tent, leaving the old man standing alone on the gravel. I watched from behind a thick row of weeping privet hedges, my jaw tightening. The contrast between her public elegance and her casual cruelty toward those she considered beneath her was staggering. My family had spent years praising her poise, her social connections, and her ability to navigate elite circles. Yet beneath the polished exterior lay a profound lack of basic empathy. A few moments later, as the terrace cleared, I saw a flash of navy blue moving near the rear service entrance. Chloe emerged from the kitchen carrying a cardboard crate filled with empty glass bottles, heading toward the recycling bins by the back wall. She moved with a steady, unhurried grace, stopping briefly to help the same elderly gardener wipe a streak of wet soil off his sleeve and offering him a sympathetic smile. I stepped out from behind the hedge, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped to maintain the facade of the wandering vagrant, and walked slowly toward the service yard. Chloe noticed me approaching and paused, setting the crate down on a low wooden crate. "Good morning," she said softly, her expression kind even in the middle of a demanding workday. "Did you manage to stay dry through the storm?" The cottage the elderly woman directed me to was warm enough, I replied, pitching my voice to sound tired and raspy. "Thank you for the food last night. It kept me going." Chloe smiled, a genuine, unforced expression that seemed entirely out of place in a household dominated by stress and status. "You don't need to thank me twice. I just brought what was left over from the staff kitchen." She hesitated, glancing toward the mansion windows before looking back at me. "You know, if you need work or assistance getting to a shelter in the nearby town, I can ask around before my shift ends tomorrow. People shouldn't have to sleep out in the elements." I looked into her eyes, struck by the depth of her compassion. Here was a young woman working herself to exhaustion just to pay for her education and support her family, yet she still found room in her heart to care for a total stranger who looked like he had nothing. "You'd really help someone you've only just met?" I asked quietly. Chloe shrugged, a gentle movement of her shoulders. "Someone once helped my mother, when we had nothing left after the factory closed. I promised myself I'd pass it on whenever I got the chance." Before I could answer, the sharp clatter of heels on stone echoed from the service doorway. Clara stepped out into the courtyard, her eyes darting across the yard until they locked onto Chloe standing near the recycling bins. "Chloe!" Clara called out, her voice slicing through the morning air like glass. "What are you doing wasting time out here? The catering manager has been looking for you for 10 minutes. If you can't manage your schedule, we can easily find someone from the agency who can." Chloe lowered her gaze respectfully, though her jaw tightened just a fraction. "I was just clearing the empties, Miss Vance. I'm heading back inside now." "Do it immediately," Clara ordered, turning sharply on her heel and disappearing back into the cool interior of the mansion. Chloe let out a quiet breath, offering me an apologetic glance. "Take care of yourself," she murmured softly, picking up her empty crate and hurrying toward the service doors. I stood alone in the quiet courtyard, watching the heavy oak door swing shut behind her. The test I had designed for Clara was already complete, and the answer was painfully clear. But as I stood there in my torn coat and fake beard, I realized that the experiment had accidentally revealed something else entirely. Something I never expected to find within the sterile, high-stakes world of my family's social ambitions. The afternoon sun broke through the thinning cloud cover, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns and stone terraces of the estate. I stood near the edge of the old carriage house, still wearing the tattered wool coat and the artificial gray beard tucked safely into my pocket, watching the steady stream of high-profile guests arriving for the formal evening reception. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers flared to life, reflecting off polished mahogany floors and gleaming silver place settings. This was the pinnacle of the pre-wedding festivities, an exclusive gathering designed to showcase the merging of two powerful corporate dynasties. Upstairs in the bridal suite, Clara stood before a massive gilded mirror, smoothing the silk fabric of her designer gown while her attendants fussed over her veil. "Everything must look flawless tonight," she remarked, her voice clipped and impatient. "The Vance name opens doors across every major market in the country. After tomorrow, our position is secure." Downstairs, I prepared for the final phase of my plan. I had traded the heavy, muddy boots for a cleaner pair of shoes, but I kept the worn coat and the gray facial hair close at hand for one final appearance. In my hand, I held a heavy cream-colored envelope bearing my personal seal, addressed formally to Mr. Marcus Sterling. As the first wave of elite guests began filtering from the foyer toward the dining hall, I stepped out from the shadows of the side colonnade and walked purposefully toward the main entrance. The security guard stationed by the heavy double doors immediately stepped into my path, his expression hardening with practiced hostility. "You don't belong here, old man. Move along before I have you physically removed from the property." I kept my head bowed just enough to obscure my features, raising the sealed envelope in my trembling hand. "I only need to deliver this message directly to Mr. Marcus Sterling," I murmured, pitching my voice to match the character I had played for the past 48 hours. Before the guard could shove me back down the steps, Clara appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her eyes sweeping over the commotion in the entryway. The moment she spotted the ragged figure standing near the threshold, her face tightened with visible fury. "What is he doing back here?" she demanded, her voice carrying clearly across the marble hall as conversations among the arriving guests sputtered to a halt. I gave explicit instructions to clear the grounds of these vagrants. "Remove him immediately before he ruins the evening." The guard grabbed my arm roughly, pulling me toward the outer doors. But before he could drag me outside, a quiet, steady voice intervened from the edge of the service corridor. "Please, let him go," Chloe said, stepping forward with her hands clasped respectfully in front of her. "He only brought a letter. It won't take a minute." Clara glared down at her from the landing, her patience completely exhausted. "Chloe, this is none of your concern. You are defending a beggar in front of our most important investors. Get back to your duties right now." The hallway fell into an uncomfortable, suffocating silence. I looked from Clara's cold, irritated expression to Chloe's calm, compassionate face, realizing instantly that the test was entirely over. My heart was no longer troubled by doubt. It was anchored in absolute certainty. Slowly, deliberately, I reached up to my face, caught the edge of the artificial gray beard, and peeled it away from my skin. Several guests gasped as I dropped the coarse hair onto a nearby mahogany table. I pulled off the worn woolen cap, wiped the dark stage makeup from my forehead, and straightened my posture to my full height. Clara's face drained of all color, her lips parting in silent shock as she stared down at me. "Marcus," she breathed, the name barely audible over the hum of the distant string quartet. The heavy oak doors of the grand foyer remained open as the murmurs of shock slowly gave way to an uncomfortable, tense silence. I stood near the base of the staircase, the heavy wool coat hanging loosely from my shoulders, while the artificial beard and stage makeup lay discarded on the mahogany table beside me. The guests who had spent the last hour whispering among themselves now stared in absolute disbelief, their eyes darting back and forth between my face and Clara's frozen expression. Clara took a slow, unsteady step down the final riser, her fingers clutching the banister as if she needed it to keep from falling. "Marcus, this isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice losing its crisp, authoritative edge, replaced by a desperate, panicked urgency. "I didn't know it was you. If I had known you were at the gate, I would have—" "You would have acted exactly the same way," I interrupted, my tone calm, level, and entirely devoid of anger. "That is the entire point, Clara. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the wealthy investors and family friends who were watching every movement from the edge of the hallway. "I was just trying to protect the schedule," she pleaded, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "It's a high-profile event. My parents have spent months organizing every detail. You can't judge my entire character based on one misunderstanding with a stranger." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," I replied quietly, stepping past her to pick up the cream-colored envelope I had placed on the table. "A misunderstanding is misinterpreting a schedule or mixing up a time. What happened outside was a clear reflection of how you treat human beings who you believe have nothing to offer you." Clara's mother pushed through the crowd from the drawing room, her face flushed with humiliation. "Marcus, please," she intervened, her voice trembling. "Let's not make a scene in front of our guests. We can discuss this privately in the study." I shook my head slowly. There is nothing left to discuss in private. Tonight was never about humiliating anyone. It was about discovering the truth before making a lifelong commitment. I looked back at Clara, whose eyes were now swimming with tears, not tears of remorse, but tears of fear, as she realized the status and security she had anchored her entire future to were slipping through her fingers. I cannot build a marriage on a foundation where kindness is dictated by social standing. We are done. Without waiting for another word, I turned and walked toward the side corridor, leaving the silence of the grand foyer behind me. As I made my way toward the exit, my eyes caught a familiar figure standing near the service doors. Chloe was watching me with an expression of profound astonishment, her hands clasped tightly together, still processing the reality that the ragged man she had fed in the rain was the billionaire owner of the estate's most prominent corporate partner. I paused for a fraction of a second, offering her a quiet, genuine nod of gratitude, before stepping out into the cool night air. The following morning, the mansion was cloaked in an unnatural, heavy quiet. The expensive floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers remained, but the vibrant energy of the pre-wedding celebration had evaporated overnight. I sat in the estate's private library with Clara and her parents, maintaining a calm, respectful demeanor while delivering the final confirmation that the engagement was permanently dissolved. Clara sat rigidly in an armchair, her eyes swollen from crying, unable to find the words to argue against a reality she had created with her own indifference. Once the formalities were concluded, I walked out through the side gardens toward the small, ivy-covered cottage where I had spent the previous 2 nights. Chloe was inside, quietly packing away a stack of spare linens into a storage crate before her shift ended. The moment she heard the door creak open and saw me standing in the doorway, she froze, her cheeks flushing with sudden embarrassment. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, quickly lowering her gaze, I'm so sorry about everything. If I had any idea who you were when you were out in the storm..." "Please don't ever apologize for treating me like a human being, Chloe," I interrupted gently, stepping into the cozy room. She relaxed slightly, though a nervous tension still lingered in her posture. "It's just hard to wrap my head around. You own half the financial portfolios in the city, and you were sitting on these steps eating burnt toast." A genuine smile broke across my face. That toast was actually quite good. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out a slim leather folder, placing it gently on the wooden table between us. "Aunt Eleanor mentioned something to me yesterday. She told me about your long-term goal of completing your degree and entering a professional nursing program, and how you've been putting that dream on hold to support your younger brother's engineering studies." Chloe's eyes widened in alarm as she looked down at the folder. "She shouldn't have told you that. That's private." "I'm very glad she did," I replied warmly. "Open it." With hesitant fingers, Chloe opened the cover. Inside lay an official acceptance package and complete enrollment documentation for an accredited top-tier nursing school in Hartford, accompanied by a letter confirming that all tuition, housing, and material expenses had been fully and permanently covered. She stared at the pages in utter disbelief, her breath catching in her throat. I don't understand. Why would you do this? Because when I arrived at these gates pretending to have absolutely nothing, I said softly, meeting her gaze. You didn't look at my torn coat or my muddy boots. You saw someone who was cold and hungry, and you offered me food, warmth, and dignity, without expecting a single thing in return. The world has plenty of people who know how to calculate value, Chloe. It needs more people who know how to care. Tears spilled over her lashes, tracing slow paths down her cheeks as a radiant, disbelieving smile slowly broke through. For the first time since I had stepped foot onto the estate, I felt a deep, abiding sense of peace settle over me, knowing that walking away from a life built on illusion was the best decision I had ever made. The silence in the library was heavy with the weight of unchosen paths and quiet consequences. I stood by the tall, arched windows, watching the first rays of morning sunlight catch the dew on the manicured lawns outside, while Clara sat motionless in her chair, staring blankly at the polished mahogany floor. Her parents had long since retreated to the West Wing, unwilling or unable to defend a position built entirely on surface polish and social transaction. The realization that my departure was absolute hung over the room like an unspoken sentence. I know I cannot undo what was said, Clara murmured, her voice cracking as she finally looked up, her eyes hollow and defeated. I let myself get caught up in expectations that never really mattered. You focused on protecting a status that didn't have a soul, I replied quietly, turning back to face her. And that is why this is the only correct path forward. With a final, courteous nod, I left the main house behind and walked across the damp grass toward the small garden cottage. When I pushed open the wooden door, Chloe was already folding the last of the blankets, her expression shifting from surprise to cautious politeness as she stepped back. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice hesitant, "I thought you'd already left for the city." "I wanted to make sure everything was settled before I head back," I said, stepping inside the warm, simple room. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, heavy brass key, placing it on the wooden table beside her folded linens. "This is the key to the main gate lodge on the north perimeter. It's quiet, fully furnished, and entirely yours for as long as you need it while you complete your program in Hartford. You won't have to worry about rent or late-night commutes anymore." Chloe stared at the key in absolute astonishment, shaking her head as she took a step back. "I can't accept that. You've already paid for my entire tuition and housing. I can't take a house on top of all of that." "It's not charity, Chloe," I said, my tone firm yet gentle. "It's an investment in someone who actually understands what it means to build something real. You kept me warm when I was freezing, and you offered dignity to a stranger when everyone else looked away. Let me give you a stable foundation so you can do the same for your patients." For a long moment, she looked at the key, her eyes shining with unshed tears as the magnitude of the change truly set in. Slowly, a soft, genuine smile broke across her face, replacing the exhaustion and worry that had defined her features since we first met in the rain. "Thank you, Marcus," she whispered, using my first name for the very first time. 3 months later, Chloe had settled seamlessly into her role at the community healthcare center near the river. The chaotic, superficial world of elite galas and corporate mergers felt like a lifetime away, replaced by the steady rhythm of hospital shifts, grateful patients, and quiet evenings watching the sun set over the water. Whenever my schedule permitted, I would drive out to meet her after her shift ended, and we would walk together through the riverfront park, talking about everything and nothing at all. One evening, as the autumn breeze rustled the golden leaves above us, we stopped near a stone bench overlooking the slow-moving river. I looked at her, realizing with absolute clarity how much my life had transformed since the night I stood outside the iron gates in a tattered coat and a fake beard. "When I came to that mansion disguised as a homeless traveler," I said softly, I thought I was testing the heart of the woman I was supposed to marry. Chloe turned to me, her eyes warm and attentive. And instead, I found yours, I answered, taking her hands gently in mine. I spent years surrounded by people who only cared about my success, my portfolio, and my name. You were the first person who cared about me when you believed I had nothing left in the world. She felt her breath catch as I stepped closer, my voice steady and certain. I didn't need another grand estate, another corporate merger, or another artificial display of wealth. I wanted the ordinary mornings, the quiet victories, the difficult days, and every real moment in between. I want to spend the rest of my life learning how to love people the way you do, Chloe, I said softly. Will you give me the honor of sharing your life from now on? Chloe looked at me, her eyes shining with emotion, before a radiant, beautiful smile spread across her face. Always. As she whispered the word, I pulled her close into my arms, the cool evening breeze fading against the warmth of a future we were building together. The man who had arrived at a wealthy estate disguised as a destitute stranger had lost his fortune for a single weekend, only to discover something infinitely more valuable than all the billions in the world. A heart that chose kindness first and love second. Sometimes, the only way to find what is truly real is to strip away every illusion and see who remains standing in the storm.